Welcome to our study this week of Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, and then chapter 2, verses 1 through 6, and verses 16 to 18. My name is Scott Rainey, and I serve with the Church of the Nazarene in the area of Sunday School and Discipleship Ministries International, or sometimes called SDMI. This adult Sunday School video lesson is provided in collaboration between the Foundry Publishing and SDMI. The video Sunday school lesson is intended to support the local church's effort to make disciples who make disciples. Please feel free to use this video in any way that helps your church or your families. I want to begin today with just sharing my screen with a few fun memes that I came across. Here's one of them. A wise doctor once wrote, and there you have that beautiful writing that doctors have. How about this one? Just picked up my social distance support animal. That'll help with the space. How about this one? I may have just made a mistake, said this surfer. Here's a good one. Haters will say it's Photoshop. Here's another one that kind of relates to today. Things don't always go as planned. This has been our life in the last 4 months. How about this one? Me, 24/7. Particularly these last four memes were showing surfers and the reality of what it's like to be on the waves. Today in our lesson, we're going to take a look at a number of waves that come into Jerusalem, but not waves of water, but waves of people. As we've been learning in the past few weeks, the two Old Testament books, Ezra and Nehemiah, are rich resources for the Israelite history of what is called the Restoration period. This period in Israel's history describes the return from Babylonia to Judah by several waves of immigrant Jews. The first wave was in 538 BC, when a relatively small number of exiles returned immediately after the Persian king Cyrus issued a decree permitting that all who desired to return to Jerusalem could feel free to go. This group that returned rebuilt the altar of God, began regular and annual sacrifices, and worked on the foundation for the temple. The second wave happened in 520 BC, with a much larger group of Jews returning with the sole purpose of rebuilding the temple. The rebuilding of the temple was completed in just 5 years in the year 515 BC. The third wave of Jews returned to Jerusalem came in 458 BC. This was when the scribe Ezra returned. The primary focus when Ezra returned was on restructuring the community around the law of Moses. Ezra had found that the people living in Jerusalem were living in great apathy to spiritual matters. They were intermarrying with the people of Canaan, thus diluting the pure faith of God's people. As we now look to the book of Nehemiah, to continue the story, we find Nehemiah's desire to rebuild the walls around Jerusalem. It's now 444 BC, almost 100 years after the first wave of Jews returned to Jerusalem. Nehemiah was not a biblical scribe. He was not a prophet. He was not in the kingly genealogical line of David. Nehemiah was a layman, as we would say today. He was born in captivity, and he lived in the city of Susa, the winter capital of the Persian king Artaxerxes. Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 11 reveals that he was cupbearer to the king. This job would have been a fairly prestigious job in the Persian kingdom. We're not sure exactly what responsibilities went with the job, but his assignment brought him into daily contact with the king. Traditionally, we know that the cupbearer would have sipped the cup the king to ensure that the drink was not poisonous. Likely, as the cupbearer of the king, Nehemiah would have overseen the royal vineyards, produced and stored the wine for the king's table and presented it at each meal. He might also have been in charge of the royal kitchens where the king's daily meals were prepared. In the end, his role was one of high character, integrity, trustworthiness, and leadership that equipped him for the daunting project of rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. Let me just mention in passing before we read our scripture today that God always equips those he calls. He prepares us in one assignment for what he desires us to do in the next assignment. And know this for sure, he has called and equipped you for his special purpose in your life. So let's take a look at Nehemiah's sense of passion, his calling, his departure, and his first days on the job. And I'm going to share the screen again with you today so that you can watch along with me as I read the scripture. Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, when I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, "Those who survived the exile are back in the province, are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire." When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. And then moving over to Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 6. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before. So the king asked me, "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart." I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" The king said to me, "What is it that you want?" Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city of Judah, where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it." Then the king, with the queen sitting next to him, asked me, "How long will your journey take, and when will you get back?" It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. And then finally, Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 16 to 18. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work. Then I said to them, "You see the trouble we are in? Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace." I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. They replied, "Let us start building." So they began this good work. The first verses of Nehemiah revealed the need in Jerusalem. Looking back to Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Nehemiah meets up with his brother Hanani, who just returned from Judah. He asked his brother about the Jewish remnant in Jerusalem. Nehemiah, like many Jews who lived far from their homeland, probably assumed that the land had pretty much returned to normal. What we learned from his brother, however, was very troubling. The people of Jerusalem were in dire need, and the city of Jerusalem was still in ruins, with large breaches in the outer wall and no functioning gates. Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 3 says that the people were in great trouble and disgrace. The word for disgrace includes the idea of being ridiculed. Jeremiah's neighbors mocked the city as well as its God because the walls and the gates remained in disrepair. Nehemiah knew from this report from his brother that the people of Jerusalem were humiliated and God's honor was at stake. Nehemiah's first response was to weep. Maybe for the first time in his life, Nehemiah identified with the plight of his own people, and he mourned for them. In our country today, we're experiencing a moment in our history to speak and act on racial reconciliation and justice for all. I want to take a moment here to pause, like Nehemiah, and identify with our people. Maybe even make it more personal, identifying with our Nazarene brothers and sisters in the USA and Canada and around the world who are suffering because of racial injustices. And I want to say this prayer today. Lord, help me to hear their cries, to identify with their struggles, and to weep with them today. We learn in verse 4 that Nehemiah wept. He fasted and he prayed for some days before the God of heaven. His immediate response was to fast and to pray. The words of his prayer are recorded in Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 5 through 11. You can read them at your own convenience. They're an attempt to remind God of his covenantal obligation and a request from Nehemiah for God to work through him to achieve a change in Jerusalem's condition. And so again, today, I want to pray, Lord, would you use me? Would you use us to bring about positive change for those who suffer in our world today? As we move into Jeremiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 6, we find Nehemiah bringing a request to the king. It's important to note that according to the month mentioned in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 1, the month of Nisan, 4 months had passed since he first heard of the great problems of Jerusalem. He wept, he fasted, he prayed, and he waited 4 months. Waiting for God's timing is not easy, is it? But we can learn from Nehemiah as he waited on God for the right time to act. At one of King Artaxerxes' meals, as Nehemiah was serving wine, the king noticed a change in Nehemiah's countenance. He seemed to be sad and depressed. I am sure that Nehemiah had been praying that God would open a door for him to speak with the king. It seems that God prompted the king to speak first, and the moment was now. Nehemiah used much wisdom when he responded to the king. Maybe the 4 months helped him to think through his thoughts and a plan. We don't know for sure, but we can all learn from these things that Nehemiah said. First of all, I want you to notice that he wisely avoided using words that would cause the king to reject his request immediately. Notice that he didn't even mention Jerusalem. In Ezra chapter 4, verses 17 to 24, you can find where Artaxerxes had already refused to allow Jerusalem to be rebuilt some years later. The month of Nisan was the first month of the Persian year when emperors often acted generously toward the subjects making requests. What a God-ordained opportunity and timing for bringing such a request to the king. Next, when asked by the king, "Why are you downcast?" Nehemiah begins with a statement, "May the king live forever." These words were typical words of praise, and they showed respect for the king. And then finally, the Persians had a high value for honoring ancestors. So Nehemiah's question in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 3, this is what he asks: "Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" Nehemiah connected directly to the king's own interests. I'm not going to say that Nehemiah showed great, I'm just going to say that Nehemiah showed great restraint 4 months. He showed a commitment to seeking his God before speaking, and then showed great wisdom when addressing his sensitive need with the foreign king. And the king asked him, according to Nehemiah 2:4, the king asked him, "What is it you want?" And Nehemiah prayed to the God of heaven and then answered. This is one of those arrow prayers, prayed in a split second, right in the moment. Have you ever prayed such a prayer? Lord, help me right now as I'm about to speak. Staying submitted to God first, Nehemiah used his position and chose his words wisely to gain the king's favor. The final portion of scripture for this week is found in Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 16 to 18. Our commentator has titled this section, Motivating Others. When Nehemiah arrived in Jerusalem, he first kept his mission secret from the local population. He knew that neighboring governors had contacts and relatives in Jerusalem who would report what he was doing. Nehemiah needed some time to assess the situation and to move around without being troubled. His first inspection of the wall had been done during the night, according to Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 11 to 15. Even in darkness, he was able to see the enormous task of rebuilding that lay ahead of him. The next day, he gathered the leaders and the citizens together and informed them the real purpose of his visit, to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Nehemiah appealed to the people of Jerusalem in 3 specific ways. First of all, he recalled the disgrace of the city of God. He said, Jerusalem lies in ruins. Its gates have been burned with fire. People are speaking badly about this city and about our God. Second, he revealed that he had official letters from the Persian king that approved this project, and even provided resources for the rebuilding of the walls. And then finally, he had received his inspiration to do this work from God himself. I thought about this recently. Surely people had talked about rebuilding the walls for years. Now there was someone passionate enough to do something about it. And he called the people to the task. With this information, the people were ready, and together they said, "Let us start rebuilding." Over the next few weeks, as we study the book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah will prove to be a great leader. Today, we close this lesson with his ability to motivate the exiles to do something they had talked about for many years. And they begin to build the walls around Jerusalem. Nehemiah had seen the great need and the pain of his people. He sought the Lord for wisdom, timing, and favor. And God used him to make a difference in the lives of the people of Judah. One unknown poet penned these words, "My life shall touch a dozen lives before this day is done. Leave countless marks for good or ill ere sets the evening sun. This is the wish I always wish, the prayer I always pray. Lord, may my life help other lives it touches by the way."